Good afternoon and welcome back to the Cape Town Press Club at home. It was going to be a live event, but then we went back into lockdown. So thank you to our technical producer, Margriet Groenewold, for setting up today. This January, Wikipedia turned 20 years old. It has been an extraordinary achievement, with daily page views running in the billions. Millions of people, like you and me, constantly use it, but also millions of people volunteer their time to edit and update it. One of these people is Douglas Scott, who has been a volunteer editor on the English language Wikipedia since 2006 and a Wikipedia community leader since 2012. He's currently a board member of Wikimedia South Africa and was the chapter's president from 2015 until 2020. In 2018, he was the organizing chairperson for that year's Wikimania, its official annual international conference, which he was crucially involved in bringing to South Africa for the first time. Wikimedia South Africa is the non-profit membership organization for the Wikipedia editors. Established in 2011, it is one of over 40 chapters and thematic organizations around the world, and it is currently the only chapter in Africa. The chapter works with the Wikipedia Foundation, the non-profit that runs the servers that Wikipedia is based on, and also programs to support the growth of Wikipedia. Like all Wikimedia South Africa members, Douglas does this as an unpaid volunteer. His day job is as a criminologist and technologist for the Safety Lab. He will be speaking to us today about the challenges Wikipedia and other internet-based free knowledge projects face in South Africa. He'll be speaking on behalf of Wikimedia South Africa. Remember, if you're watching this live and you're logged in, you may ask questions at any time, and I will get to as many of these after the presentation. Douglas Scott, welcome.
Thank you, Brent. I'm just going to give everyone a brief outline of how I'm going to do this presentation and sort of questions and answers / discussion. I'm first going to give a brief outline on what Wikipedia is, followed by a video prepared by the Wikimedia Foundation, so celebrating the 20th birthday of Wikipedia. And that'll give everyone sort of an idea of Wikipedia's growth over the past 20 years. That's quite a short video, only about 2 minutes. After that, I'll talk about Wikipedia in South Africa. After that, I'll focus on challenges that Wikipedia will need to, that we believe Wikipedia will need to overcome in the next 20 years, especially here in South Africa. Thereafter, I'll be taking questions. Thank you. So what is Wikipedia? What is this sort of remarkable internet phenomenon that sort of we're all talking about in its 20th year of existence? The 15th of January 2001 is when it was founded. But what exactly is it? You ask most people, they'll very reasonably say that, well, it's a free online encyclopedia. And that is certainly the product of Wikipedia. That is certainly what most people see and use and take great value from. And that's absolutely fantastic. But that's not what it is at its core. That's not what its engine is, so to speak. At least that's not what I believe its engine to be. It's also not a technology platform. True, the MediaWiki technology platform that Wikipedia is built on is very important to making Wikipedia possible, but that's not what Wikipedia really is, if you were to ask me. What is Wikipedia is the community of editors, the hundreds of thousands of people who voluntarily and freely donate their time, expertise, and knowledge to contribute to the free knowledge project that is Wikipedia. And the product of that is this free online encyclopedia. The, I suppose, philosophy that kind of guides this community of editors can best be described in the quote that I've provided in my slide below, and it comes from Jimmy Wales, one of the two founders of Wikipedia. A world in which every single human can freely share in the sum of all knowledge. And it is within that context that I sort of want to give this presentation to everyone here today. And I sort of ask everyone to sort of keep that in mind. That's sort of guiding principle of our community of the free knowledge movement, a world in which every single human can freely share in the sum of all knowledge. And on that note, before I dive into sort of the impact of Wikipedia, I'm going to play a quick video on sort of the past 20 years of Wikipedia. Thank you.
This year, Wikipedia is turning 20 years old.
Happy birthday, Wikipedia!
Wikipedia began with a very radical idea. Imagine a world in which every single person on the planet is given free access to the sum of human knowledge.
The knowledge in Wikipedia comes from people like me.
It takes a village to build Wikipedia.
When thousands of people come together to share their knowledge voluntarily and build up a big encyclopedia, it's a knowledge revolution.
The fact that anybody anywhere in the world can contribute to the platform makes the difference.
Wikipedia is human because it is us.
Today, Wikipedia has over 53 million articles across nearly 300 languages.
In our era, Wikipedia has become the voice.
For me, Wikipedia is a real way to change the world, because the knowledge I share is the knowledge other people have.
Everything is on Wikipedia. It is funny and it is brilliant.
There's war heroes and battles.
Pregnancy and childbirth. The constellations of the zodiac.
Women in science.
The grandfather's paradox, about time travel going back into the past.
Even Ghanaian dance.
And also sex in space.
We're living in amazing times, really.
There's a saying that knowledge is power. When you know something, how does that make you respond?
When the COVID-19 pandemic happened, as a medical doctor, I had to do something. Sharing crucial information about the disease.
I've been editing Wikipedia since I was 12.
I was born to do this.
This is the human spirit. We live for knowledge.
Because you can't really explain why so many people would take so much time and dedicate themselves to this project. But people do.
Helping build free knowledge.
This is our story.
It's a human effort, making Wikipedia the best site we can have, and the source of knowledge for humanity. To make humanity a better place.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I want to quickly dive into now, like what has been the impact of Wikipedia over the past 20 years, and sort of highlight some of the, I suppose, the scale and the magnitude of the project, and I suppose why it is influential. So Wikipedia currently has over 55 million articles across 300 different language versions of Wikipedia. It's not just English language Wikipedia. English language is the largest version of Wikipedia at over 6 million articles. And as of a few days ago, over 1 billion edits by its 127,000 active editors. But it isn't the only language version of Wikipedia. There are many, many other versions of Wikipedia, which I will sort of discuss more about in this presentation. And it's sort of one of the reasons why we are choosing to highlight these issues that I'm going to talk about here today in this presentation on this 20th birthday. Wikipedia is edited by, as I mentioned, a large community of volunteer unpaid editors, over 280,000 editors across all language versions of Wikipedia. To illustrate the scale of the project, it's edited over 350 times per minute. That sort of gives some insight into the depth and range of content in Wikipedia and all the different versions. Some of these edits are adding new content to Wikipedia, writing new articles. Others are deleting and removing old or outdated content, or even wrong content. It's sort of part of the peer review process. Whereas other edits are sort of more just copy checking or sorting or categorizing things. So it's easier to find what you're looking for. Wikipedia is viewed over 8,000 times a second, which makes Wikipedia one of the largest websites on the internet. Depending on which source you look or when you look, it can range anywhere from being sort of the 5th most visited website on the internet to being the 14th most visited website on the internet. So it does have some scale. But how is all this funded? I mean, like, we still got to pay for servers to run the website, to host the images, to host the content. Where does that money come from? Where does the money come from to hire the programmers and developers to make it easier for the volunteer editors to add content, to sort of host community building events, to sort of help the community grow? Well, the answer to that is it comes from people like you, members of the public, millions of members of the public from all over the world, making millions of small donations every year. The average donation being around $15 US. And I just got the statistic there. We've got over 7 million donors on average, sort of making a donation every year. So that means that Wikipedia is thankfully reasonably well-funded enough to sort of continue the free knowledge public benefit service that it exists to provide. So providing that sum of human knowledge freely accessible to everyone everywhere. What about in South Africa? Well, in South Africa, Wikipedia is viewed up to 72 million times a month. And that's just on English language Wikipedia alone. There are almost every South African language has got its own version of Wikipedia, which also have got many views. It's edited by just under 3,600 active editors in South Africa in any given time period. That represents about 15% of all editors in Africa, which does highlight the need for more editors in Africa broadly. And around 85% of our editors, according to a survey we did back in 2015, are male. About just under 70% of whom either speak English or Afrikaans as a first language. It's an important distinction to make with these two figures in comparison to the first two figures I presented here in South Africa, is that the demographic figures I just presented come from a survey we did 5 years ago, so they're a bit out of date, but the trends still remain the same. Another thing that same survey highlighted to us in addition to there being a gender and ethnocultural or racial sort of disparity in sort of amongst Wikipedia editors, there's also a geographical disparity in that most of our editors tend to come from the major metropolitan areas of South Africa, and you can see that in the map below, where just over 70% of Wikipedia editors either come from Gauteng or the Western Cape, predominantly Johannesburg or Cape Town, and predominantly around the universities of these two cities. And that does highlight a geographical disparity within South Africa. So what are the challenges for the next 20 years facing Wikipedia, both globally, but more specifically here in South Africa? Well, there's a changing internet. Billions of people from emerging countries are coming online over the next 20 years, or will be coming online over the next 20 years. Wikipedia does have to make sure that if we are to live up to our philosophy, our mantra of providing the sum of human knowledge to everyone, everywhere, freely, the mission does need to better cater to their interests, the interests of people from emerging countries. And part of that means increasing the diversity of content in Wikipedia, and I'll talk about that in my next slide. Another part of that is increasing access to knowledge in different languages, and African languages are, to us here in South Africa, a particularly important one. Another sort of challenge facing Wikipedia over the next 20 years is a changing world, and that means many things. But the one I'm going to focus on here today is the regrettable rise and spread of misinformation and disinformation on the internet. Wikipedia has not been immune to it, but Wikipedia has managed to deal with it, at least we feel, a bit better than most other sort of internet entities out there. And I'll talk a bit more about how that is and what that means. I'm going to sort of mention this quite a lot throughout my presentation. A solution to all of these challenges and problems is expanding the community of editors that voluntarily and freely edit Wikipedia and devote and donate their knowledge and time. Yes, people can support Wikipedia by making a donation, and obviously we always encourage that. It's always good to keep the servers running that Wikipedia runs on. But really, what is needed in our part of the world, in South Africa, in Africa broadly, in emerging countries generally, is a need for more volunteer editors to add content to sort of make Wikipedia even better, more relevant, and a more reliable reference source than it already is for people around the world. So this map that I'm now showing, that you can now see, I think quite well illustrates the problem, the nature of the problem that we face. Currently, so this map basically shows the number of Wikipedia edits per 10,000 or per number of internet users in each country. And as you can see that the number of Wikipedia edits in sort of developed countries in North America and Europe per internet user is much higher than it is in the rest of the world. China and Africa are two notable examples. China is a part of the world we don't have much control. We don't have any control over. So resolving that situation, that's because the Chinese government essentially bans Wikipedia. But for the rest of the world, where Wikipedia is freely available, we can certainly all work together to make a difference, to enhance the content and the quality and the relevance of content on Wikipedia by encouraging people from around the world, and especially people from parts of the world where Wikipedia is under-edited, to join the movement and edit Wikipedia. And we do realize that editing Wikipedia is not for everyone. But the reason why we sort of talking about this message and try to spread this message is to sort of highlight it in the hope that to as many people as possible, in the hope that the 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 1,000 people who find editing Wikipedia very appealing, give it a try and find it very appealing, will contribute to it and thereby sort of help grow the Free Knowledge Project. And Wikipedia really is a platform where one person can make a very big difference and a very positive pro-social difference, and all from the comfort of your own home if you've got internet access. Typically, these countries, most of these countries which sort of are underrepresented in terms of number of edits, are typically countries where access to the internet has been a very big problem or denied due to sort of lack of material access. But that is now beginning to change. It's sort of part of the changing world, changing internet that is now evolving, where more and more people in these countries are now beginning to come online, thereby overcoming this problem. And that's why now is a particularly important time to sort of encourage people to contribute to the Free Knowledge Project, that is Wikipedia, and thereby promote the growth of knowledge, not just for the benefit of people in their own countries, but for people everywhere. You know, a person in North America also benefits from someone in Angola editing about topics that are relevant to their country, because they have equal access to that knowledge. So one of the sort of key issues or hurdles that I previously mentioned that Wikipedia needs to overcome is this issue of diversity. Currently, Wikipedia is mostly edited, as you would have seen from the previous map, mostly edited by people in highly developed Northern Hemisphere countries. Typically, these people are male and sort of very, very technology focused. And that means that the nature of the content of Wikipedia covers subjects that are of interest to those people very well. Wikipedia editors, being volunteer editors, it's unreasonable for the existing sort of community of editors or individual editors to edit on anything other than things that are personally of interest to them, because obviously we're all volunteer editors. And that is why sort of having a greater diversity of editors is so important. If we have more female editors, if we have more Black editors, we have more African language editors, more area expert editors, it greatly improves the range of content that Wikipedia covers, which makes Wikipedia more relevant to a greater proportion of humanity, thereby helping to serve sort of our movement's mission of providing the sum of human knowledge freely accessible to everyone everywhere. Another important reason why diversity is important is that it promotes a neutral point of view. A neutral point of view is very important in Wikipedia. If Wikipedia is to ever become a an encyclopedic reference, a reliable encyclopedic reference. And a neutral point of view can only really be achieved as a sort of a group effort amongst a diverse range of people. The more people that are reviewing an article, the more likely a diverse range of viewpoints will come across that article, and more likely to spot problems with the article, either because it describes an issue in a problematic way, or because it's excluding key bits of information which don't provide a full picture of that article's subject, or some other reason. And more people, given the nature of the peer review collective editing process and environment that Wikipedia is, the more people that view it, the more likely we are to sort of overcome many of the bias problems, the problems around biasy, and thereby achieve a neutral point of view. And I've already talked about why Wikipedia editors are important to achieve this, or more editors. And in particular, I sort of do want to reiterate here how we need editors from all walks of life, more editors from all walks of life. But there is, and I want to reiterate this, a particular need for more Wikipedia volunteer editors, for Black language versions of Wikipedia, for Black editors and female editors, as well as area expert editors, to really sort of help us become a more diverse community. So African language Wikipedias, well, currently sadly, almost every single South African language has got its own version of Wikipedia. Sadly, it's not all languages in South Africa that have its own Wikipedia yet. But currently, it's available in sort of Afrikaans, Bile, Tonga, Tswana, Sesotho, Swati, Xhosa, Zulu, as well as obviously in English. Afrikaans Wikipedia, very, very happy to say, is a thriving community. It's expected to have over 200 editors. It's expected to reach its 100,000th article sometime this year, and later this year, November, will be celebrating its 20th birthday. So Afrikaans Wikipedia is doing well. Zulu Wikipedia, I'm happy to say, is also growing nicely, slowly but surely, sort of a dedicated pioneering community of about 25 volunteer editors are devoting their time to Zulu. But there's certainly room to grow and expand that Wikipedia further. It currently only got about 7,000 articles. Other language versions, South African language versions of Wikipedia are sadly need a lot more love. So Xhosa language Wikipedia, for example, has only got about 1,000 articles. And that's for a community of over 8 million language speakers, Xhosa language speakers, which makes it one of the most sort of under-resourced or under-referenced Wikipedias out there per language speaker in the world. Which means that if you're a Xhosa language speaker, finding content in your language that is relevant and important to you, finding knowledge in your language, is much harder than it is if you're a speaker of many other languages. And if we ever want to live up to our mission of the sum of all human knowledge, freely accessible to everyone everywhere, that is a problem, along with all the other languages. So overcoming this problem for the other languages is one that we must overcome. And again, expanding the number of editors, encouraging first language or even second or third language speakers of these languages to edit Wikipedia is a very important part of overcoming this problem. So there's a greater need for more love and attention for these South African language Wikipedias other than English. Although there certainly is a need for more English language editors as well. Editing Wikipedia is not the only way that people can help out. If a person's very passionate about sort of strengthening their language, but you're not into editing in a free online encyclopedia, that's fine. That's not the only way that a person can sort of help these language versions of Wikipedia. Another way is just sort of being a linguistic champion and raising attention, bringing attention to the existence of these different language versions of Wikipedia. So if you're a very passionate person about, say, Swati language, the Swati language, and you really want to support Swahili language Wikipedia, then you can tell people about Swahili language Wikipedia and inform people that that it exists and that anyone can edit it. That editing it is a great thing to do that provides a great public service to speakers of that language. That's another way to help out. Okay, so finally, disinformation and misinformation. Wikipedia has not been immune to the rise of misinformation, disinformation on the internet. It is a sad reality of our time that there's a lot of it around. Thankfully, Wikipedia has been a bit better able to deal with it than many other places on the internet. And that's pretty much entirely because of the community of editors on Wikipedia and the culture of editing Wikipedia, because the community shares a common vision of providing a public good, providing reliable knowledge to people, useful knowledge to people. The community has developed a lot of rules and norms that sort of help weed out misinformation or disinformation, finds people who are spreading it and ejects them from the community, and make sure that as many reliable references are included in Wikipedia articles as possible. And that's a very important part of the whole peer review, or a very important function of the peer review mechanism that makes Wikipedia work. A good example of what I'm talking about is in the United States elections, but the last ones and the most recent ones, where Wikipedia took a very strong stance, both as a community and the foundation that supports Wikipedia took a very strong stance to help prevent using Wikipedia as a platform to spread misinformation or disinformation about the US elections. And there's a whole lot of articles that have been written about that. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but basically a community of thousands of editors sort of got together to make it their mission to review and frequently review hundreds of articles relevant to the US elections to make sure that bad information did not get on there. And this also included locking up to 13 different articles relevant to the US elections. Locking basically means that only highly respected and proven Wikipedia editors, volunteer editors, can make additions to those articles instead of it being open to everyone. And this is all sort of helped greatly in reducing the level of misinformation on Wikipedia. Another sort of example of misinformation is the link between COVID-19 and G5 cell phone networks, 5G cell phone networks. Wikipedia has sort of become a platform for informing people about what is misinformation regarding COVID-19 and regarding 5G, and sort of pointing out through the provision of reliable references, pointing out the tenuous or the fact that there is no link between 5G and COVID-19, that it's a conspiracy theory, and highlighting this and providing sort of reliable information about this phenomenon. South Africa is not immune to this problem. In South Africa, there was a case where the Wikipedia article about the Gupta family, the Gupta brothers, was the target of a missile, perhaps even disinformation campaign of Bell Pottinger, the PR firm that the Guptas very controversially hired to sort of make themselves look better than they perhaps were. And that sort of highlighted how even in South Africa, we have to be aware. More editors really is one of the best solutions to this problem, because the more Wikipedia editors, the more people are open to editing Wikipedia there are out there, the more eyeballs that are looking at Wikipedia articles, the more likely it is we will spot vandalism, such as people inserting misinformation or disinformation, or people trying to get away with using bad references that give misleading or wrong information about a subject. Another thing that the Wikipedia community is doing, and led in this particular case by the foundation, is the creation of new tools to make it easier for the community to identify mis and disinformation and fight it and undo it. And that's basically it. That's the end of my presentation. I'm now open to questions.
Thank you very much, Douglas. That was interesting. I've got a couple of questions I'm going to jump in, and we've got a few comments that I'll come to in a moment. My ears pricked up when you said anyone can edit, and one is immediately are they not vetted or they're not checked. How do you know that the editors that are coming in as volunteers are competent? And I might just add that. Some years ago, I tried to correct a fact on Wikipedia, which I knew was incorrect because I was involved in it personally. And I got a lovely message back saying, stop vandalizing this page. And my correction was immediately taken down. I tried to do it again and it was again taken down. And I was accused of vandalism, even though I know, because I was involved, that my facts were correct.
So I missed the first sentence of your question. But I think
anyone
I got the
can edit. Anyone
yes,
can
anyone
edit.
Can edit. And how? I'm sorry.
Do you vet them? How do you judge?
So the answer is because anyone can edit, and it's a very important sort of principle for the community that anyone is allowed to edit it. Also very and somewhat paradoxically important principle for the community is that anyone is allowed to edit anonymously. And you'd think that this would greatly reduce the reliability of information on Wikipedia. What makes up for that is that the community judges the quality of people's work by their track record. And people tend to become quite attached to their avatar or their name on Wikipedia. And when the more that a person edits and the more that they edit reliably, the more of a reputation, a reliable sort of reputation that they build up. So the more likely as people are to trust it. But that is actually only a very small part of it. What is far more important to the community is that because even the most proven sort of editor can make mistakes or be guilty of malicious activities. What's most important is actually the nature of the work that they do and whether or not they follow sort of key principles. And it's the principles and the sort of editing norms that I think do the most to help ensure or promote reliability on Wikipedia. And so one of these principles is writing as a neutral point of view. Another one, which is very important, is the use of reliable references. So I think Brenton, in perhaps your case, possibly it sounds like that you might not have used a reference in that particular instance, which the community thought was reliable enough. Perhaps you were. There is a problem, a systemic bias problem in Wikipedia, whereby because the community is so dominated by people in, say, highly developed countries in sort of the Northern Hemisphere, people are generally not as aware of what passes for reliable reference in the rest of the world. So that creates a sort of a systemic bias against knowledge creation in much of the rest of the world, and it's totally unintentional, and it's done with the best of intentions, which is to sort of make sure that reliable content is on Wikipedia, but it does often have this downside where it gets very difficult to add content in Wikipedia that is reliable, that we know in, say, South Africa, we know is reliable. But because editors in, say, the United States don't recognize what we would all regard as a reliable source to be a reliable source, it means that this content might not always make it onto Wikipedia. And that is a challenge that Wikipedia needs to overcome. But generally, we're slowly sort of working to overcome that challenge. But we do need sort of more help. And this is where sort of more editors to expand the diversity of the community is very helpful.
Right. Thanks. We've got a question. The first one we're going to take up from Elmarie Waltman. She wants to contribute and write content. She's qualified. So you've got your first recruitment. So I think the question is, how does a person go about it? Because I remember when I attempted, that was a long time ago, it was quite opaque software. It was not, the interface was really not friendly. And as somebody who's relatively computer literate, I struggled a little bit. Has the interface got better? And what does a person do if they want to make a start? Where do they go?
So that's a great question, a very important question. The answer is yes, it has gotten better, or I like to believe it has gotten better. In the past sort of 5 to 10 years, something called the visual editor has become sort of widely adopted. Unfortunately, it's not the default editor yet for new editors. I personally advocate for making that the default editor for editing English language Wikipedia, for example. I know the editor you're talking about when you first started editing markup text that Wikipedia uses, which is not user-friendly, and I think is a key reason why the current community is so lopsided with sort of very technology-minded people, and it's because technology-minded people are very comfortable editing in sort of HTML markup text, whereas normal people don't really, it's quite a hurdle to overcome. The visual editor overcomes that by making editing Wikipedia more like editing a Word document. So if you can edit a Word document, that makes it a lot easier. Bringing it back to your original question, how to actually start editing Wikipedia. So the best way to start is to be bold, go to a Wikipedia page that you're passionate about. When you've spotted something that needs improvement, you'll notice in the top right-hand corner of that article, there's an edit button. You can press the edit button. It's easier if you make sure that you loaded up the visual editor, because that'll make your life a bit easier for reasons we already discussed, and make the edit directly into the article and save it. Don't worry about getting it wrong. You won't break it. Anything on Wikipedia, if anything gets broken in Wikipedia, it can be undone. That's the nature of a wiki. But the best way is to just start trying and being bold. I do always encourage people to try and sort of learn up a bit more about the norms of editing Wikipedia, because especially on English language Wikipedia, which is very large, it's become quite bureaucratic. A lot of rules have sort of grown up around it, but there are some very helpful pages on Wikipedia itself which explain how to edit Wikipedia. So if you just do a Google search for, editing how to edit Wikipedia, that might give you a good presentation, a good introduction on how to do it and what the norms are. Things to look out for would be, writing in that neutral point of view, making sure that the reference you use, well, firstly, you add references, you use references, and making sure that the reference you use is a reliable, trustworthy source. And what does that mean? What does a reliable, trustworthy source mean? So Wikipedia does actually have a definition for that. But this is all a long way of saying that really the best way to go about learning to edit Wikipedia is just by doing it and just being bold and starting from your first edit.
When you say visual editor, is that similar to the one that one uses now on WordPress?
Yes, it is quite similar to that. I'm not 100% familiar with the WordPress editor. I would liken it more to a Word document. So and that's sort of really what it's designed to be more similar to. So if you can write a document on Microsoft Word, for example, or in any other type of Word document writing software, then the visual editor will feel quite familiar to you.
Okay, good. Question from Stephen Lang. If the editors are not paid any money, are there any other benefits for volunteer editors, such as professional accreditation?
So the answer to that is yes, but I would encourage people to edit because they are sort of do it from a place of either civic good or personal interest. not self-interest. So you can edit Wikipedia and I suppose raise a profile about yourself. The example to that is that there was a professor in the United States who actually got tenure from his university by publishing over 400 articles in Wikipedia, which, because Wikipedia does qualify as peer review, and he got tenure through that. But the overwhelming majority of editors in Wikipedia don't do it for any reason of self-interest. And my personal instinct is to discourage people from doing it for self-interested reasons, but to sort of more do it because it gives you a feeling of doing something good for society, or for sharing knowledge that you have with the rest of the world, or for just sort of correcting things that are wrong on the internet. In fact, a lot of people get into Wikipedia because they found something that was wrong on the internet and they were outraged about it enough to correct it, and get involved in it through that way. I hope that's a satisfactory answer. Yeah.
I remember getting in touch with you. If we just have a look at I'll get to that now, but our next comment from Sasha, if we could throw in that one up. Hi Douglas, are we seeing much vaccine misinformation on Wikipedia?
So yes, there is a fair bit of information about vaccines. So the nature of Wikipedia being what it is, there is as much information on it that the editors of Wikipedia choose to contribute to it. Thankfully, vaccines is a topic that a great many people around the world are very interested in. And that means that knowledge in Wikipedia about the COVID vaccines is pretty good. And pretty because of the focus on sort of using reliable scientific sources is also pretty good. So especially with COVID vaccines. And I was sort of thinking, I think yesterday I was checking out the article on, it's basically a list of all the different COVID vaccines that have now been put out, and where they are in deployment around the world, and in development, and who is developing them and where they are going. And that sort of information does exist in Wikipedia, but it is a big subject. So the more interest that people sort of put into it, the more information that sort of goes in Wikipedia about a subject, such as COVID vaccines, the larger the subject gets. And so the greater coverage it gets, the more articles get produced about it. So ironically, it becomes a bit harder to navigate all that content, but it does mean there's more detail.
Yeah, I remember getting in touch with you right at the beginning of the pandemic last year in about March, April, around the COVID pages, because they were like the most looked at pages, I believe, for quite a few days at that time. And I was interested. I had some suggestions, and was debated a little bit. But then I got into the back door, or the backstage, and you mentioned collective editing in your presentation, and I was fascinated to see the debates and the discussions between the various editors about which statistics to include, how to include them, would this not look like this, and it was a very interesting process. And I wonder if you give us a little bit more insight and explain to people a bit more about that collective editing and the kind of discussions that go on backstage when editorial decisions are made, especially on something as important as the COVID statistics for South Africa as we went into the pandemic.
Oh gosh, yeah. Thanks for asking that question, because the answer to that provides actually, I think, a very important insight into how Wikipedia works, and really highlights the importance of the community in adding content. So when you go to a Wikipedia article, any Wikipedia article, you'll find that there's a talk section for that article. There's a little talk button, so I think it's in the top left corner. If you click on that, you'll find discussions relevant to how that article is being edited. And you already mentioned in sort of some of the COVID-related articles, like some of the debates that editors were having around whether we should include this statistic or that statistic, whether we should put it, display it in this way or some other way, which references we should use or prioritize, whether we should fork a page and create a new page out of this existing page, because there's so much content about this one subject within that article. That debating process is extremely important, because without it, there would be no mechanism for article-specific collaboration amongst editors who don't know each other, editors who typically would otherwise never meet or talk to each other. And but because the talk page exists, because I as an editor can debate with someone in India, for example, about whether to include this or that statistic about say COVID, we can coordinate our activities. We can discuss what is appropriate for the article. In some cases, the talks can get quite rigorous, shall I say, especially in articles that people feel very passionate about. And you can get sort of real wiki arguments and wiki debates. And sort of an example I like to use of this is city names in Poland, especially cities and towns in Poland that were once a part of Germany. So the Poles and the Germans have had a difficult 100 years together, and their border has shifted a lot over those 100 years. And in this particular instance, Polish editors typically felt that very strongly that the cities and towns should always be referred to by their Polish names, and the Germans typically felt that it should always be referred to by their German names. And there was a big ongoing debate and argument amongst these two groups of people. And eventually, through debates and sort of argumentation over the course of time, it was agreed, and both sides adhering to sort of some key Wikipedia principles, such as the importance of the neutral point of view, it was agreed by both sides that the best thing to do would be to refer to a city by its Polish name, if you're talking about it at a time when it was part of Poland or in current times, and refer to it by its German name when it was a part of Germany, which is to say typically in the past. And that's a story that kind of illustrates how an article or a consensus is thrashed out in Wikipedia. And you can see that on a great many subjects. If you want to see particular fireworks, you can always look up the talk section of an article relating to the Israel-Palestine conflict, for example.
Yeah, Sasha has another question for you. What makes a page South African specific?
Very good question. And the article to that is whether it's South African relevant. The ultimate arbiter of that, which is very easy to find by the editing community, is whether or not, when you go to the talk page of an article, you often see like there's a banner on top of each page, and it'll say what projects within Wikipedia this page is relevant to. So, for example, there's Wiki Project Medicine. If you're talking, like, all COVID articles fall under Wiki Project Medicine for obvious reasons. But COVID-19 in South Africa would fall under Wiki Project Medicine and Wiki Project South Africa. And Wiki Project is, South Africa's got its own thing. There's also Wiki Project Zimbabwe, Nigeria, and Wiki Project Crime, Wiki Project this and that. There are many, many hundreds of different Wiki projects. But in terms of making it South Africa specific, you can always go to Wiki Project South Africa. You can have a look at I think it's 26 or 28,000 articles in English language Wikipedia that are tagged as being relevant to Wiki Project South Africa. And that's probably I suppose, the best arbiter of, what makes an article a South African article.
On that little red map that you threw up showing the number of edits and the intensity of them, something which I hadn't expected to see was just how active Mongolia and Iran, I think it's Iran, it looked like to me, on that map. Yes, it is. That's definitely Iran. Iran and Mongolia. Any insight into what's happening there?
Oh, I like that question. So Mongolia, I don't know so much about, other than Mongolia's, quite a population-wise, quite a small country. Geographically, it's enormous, but there's only about, I think, as many people in Mongolia, and I need to check this figure, as there are in, I think, Cape Town or the Western Cape. so I haven't met too many editors from Mongolia, but Iran I do know something about. I've met a couple editors from Iran. They got a very strong editing community in Iran. There's something about sort of the community of editors in Iran. There's something about Iran that has just produced a very strong community of editors, Iranian editors. And they're very supportive of each other. They're very interested in education. They're very interested in sort of promoting this concept of free knowledge. And that, I think, is the main reason why they're so active there. It's a bit of a mystery to all of us why some countries tend to be more intensive editors of Wikipedia than others. So, for example, you notice that Canadians tend to, per capita, tend to edit Wikipedia more frequently than Americans do. The community doesn't really know why. I mean, there's some obvious reasons, such as, the reason why there aren't as many editors in Africa as the rest of the world is because it's just more difficult in many cases to get access to the internet in Africa, and it's harder. There are fewer people with the free time to donate to editing Wikipedia in Africa than many other parts of the world. But that is beginning to change, thankfully, in a good way. But when it comes down to some of the smaller issues, such as comparing Canada and America, as I previously mentioned, that's still an unknown. Why it is that the Canadians seem to just engage in it more than others, other than they've got perhaps a stronger community of editors.
Or perhaps they're not as busy. Leslie Cox is asking, how many hours per week on average do volunteer editors spend? I don't know if anybody's done any statistics on that. Maybe you can even speak for yourself.
So I know no statistics on how many hours on average a Wikipedia editor spends per week editing it. I suspect my guess is the answer is the average editor only spends about a minute or even a few seconds a week editing Wikipedia. And that's because the overwhelming majority of editors in Wikipedia are people who will only make one edit in a month or a year. Once in a very long while, when they come across something that they're especially knowledgeable or passionate about on Wikipedia and they really want to correct. If you're talking about sort of people who are super editors or regular editors, then you're talking about a much smaller group of people. That group, I don't know. I mean, it ranges. Some people spend many hours a week doing it, up to 3 hours a day if your person's particularly dedicated and have got the free time. Some people spend much less time, maybe only sort of a few minutes a day or a few minutes a week. The point is not really how much time a person spends editing Wikipedia. The point is more that people edit things that they're passionate and knowledgeable about. And that they feel free to do so long as obviously the information is good information.
You certainly feel that as a reader of Wikipedia. You come across an entry and you feel this entry is really written by somebody who knows what they're talking about and has got a complete handle on their subject. And then there's some others that are not incorrect. I won't say that, although I only used Wikipedia as a starting point, I must admit. And then I check your references now before moving on to. It's a very good starting point for any research. That's for sure. We've got another question from Stephen. Do you have a blog or something similar that discusses news about Wikipedia? Where do we get news?
So I don't have a blog or keep a blog on the subject, but there are a couple blogs and news portals which people can follow for information about Wikipedia. One of the ones is the Signpost, which is essentially the Wikipedia community's blog. If you search sort of Wikipedia, the Signpost, it's kind of like the community newspaper of Wikipedia. There's also one that's written and maintained by the Wikimedia Foundation. I'll need to sort of look that up as well. Or I'll need to look that up because I just can't remember the name, other than it being the Wikimedia Foundation's kind of blog. And Wikimedia Foundation, they're the non-profit that runs Wikipedia, and they run a blog which is open to many Wikipedia editors. So I've published there myself as well about some of the things we actually talked about here today. And they'll have a lot of content there that's sort of what are the goings-ons in Wikipedia in any given time. Then, if a person's really interested, they can always join one of the many, many Wikipedia mailing lists. So, for example, Wikimedia South Africa, we've got our own mailing list, which obviously people are more than welcome to join. You just need to go to the Wikimedia South Africa website. You can find the details on how to join that mailing list there. That's a plug for the South African chapter. There's also Wikimedia L, which is kind of like the big mailing list. These, as time has progressed, in the early days of Wikipedia, they were very, very frequently used, especially Wikipedia L. But I think as time has progressed, people have sort of reverted more to the Wikimedia Foundation blog, as well as there is a YouTube channel. Let me actually quickly get that name for you. There is a YouTube channel. There's a YouTube channel that the Wikipedia community runs. And it's typically run by a very active editor called Andrew Lin. And that YouTube channel, every week, there's a lot of community discussions relevant to the community. And that's a really good way to sort of follow what's going on Wikipedia.
Yeah, we can certainly send the link and information out to everybody who's registered for the for this webinar.
Yes, I'll send that out to everyone a bit later then.
Thank you. I think that's yes, and we just got asked about a mailing list, so that's fine. I think that's a good point on which to wrap it up. We've been going for an hour now, and we'd like to thank you, and also thanks to the Wikipedia Foundation for helping us with this webinar today. Thank you, Douglas.
Excellent. Thank you for having me, Brent.
Good.
Thank you.